standing at the Montana Constitutional Convention, pleading for the Indians to preserve their cultural integrity. As Delegate Champeau pointed out, there were in fact American Indians present at the convention. Diana Lupe and Mavis Scott, two University of Montana students from Poplar, were among several who testified and advocated for American Indians to be included in Montana's new contract with its people. Specifically, they requested that the state of Montana recognize the need for inclusion and implementation of culturally sensitive curricula within the public education system. Most especially, we request that the curricula shall be relevant and sensitive to Native peoples residing in the state of Montana. We would like, very simply, our history, our culture, and our identity. Delegate Dorothy Eck from Bozeman, who later became a state senator, spoke to their advocacy during her introduction of the constitutional provision on the floor. During one of our very early hearings in the Bill of Rights Committee, there appeared before us two young Indian students representing student groups of the Fort Peck Reservation. They came asking what we could do, or what the convention could do, to assure them that they would have the opportunity in their schools to study their own culture, perhaps their own language, and to develop a real feeling of pride in themselves for their own heritage and culture. And also a hope that all students all over Montana would recognize the importance and real dignity of American Indians in the life of Montana. These two ladies from Fort Peck are very likely elders today. I think we tried tracking them down and they got an award at the Montana Indian Education Association one year, but very likely elders today and are finally maybe seeing the results of their early advocacy work. After very little debate, the constitutional provision that later became known as Indian Education for All passed on an 83-1 roll call vote. Always tracking down that one. Although the Constitution is the foundation of Indian Education for All, it was necessary to define the intent and provide the resources necessary to bring it to life. Article 10, Section 1, Subsection 2 was not immediately implemented. Legislative intent was placed into statute in 1993. There were a lot of legislators who worked on that. My mom was one of them, Representative Carol Juneau at the time, bringing forward with Norma Bixby from Northern Cheyenne, a lot of Indians and non-Indian legislators pulling together to get that put into statute. So legislative intent was placed into our statute books. And still, even with legislation, there was not much implementation. There were more years of more advocacy, more committees, more conferences, more summits. And in 2004, there was a lawsuit. The Supreme Court told the legislature they were required by the Constitution to provide adequate funding for a quality education, but they had never defined quality. Therefore, they could not know if they were providing adequate funding. So the court mandated that the legislature define a quality education and then fund that definition. Indian Education for All was included and actually became the strongest piece of that lawsuit, thanks to Smith and Doherty law firm. The court said that the state was defenseless because it had shown no commitment to implementing that constitutional provision. As a result, Indian Education for All got included in a definition of a quality education and was also funded. It was appropriated funding for the state education agency and schools for the first time ever. Implementing Education for All did not happen overnight, and it's still certainly not done. It took a lot of work, organizing, educating, lobbying from many people for many, many, many years. It took political action, community and statewide advocacy, legislative action, and legal action. And these efforts continue, as this panel will talk about. You will hear about the beginnings of the movement, how it's going now, and thoughts about future progress. So let's get to the panel. I'm just going to start out with everybody kind of going through and answer the question. Please do a quick introduction of yourself, who you are, and why are you engaged in the Indian Education for All movement?
Oh, hey. Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Jordann Lankford-Forster. I'm an Ani and Anishinaabe. My Ani name is Sikbian Nitha. That means bright trail woman. I am an IEFA instructional coach from Great Falls Public School District. And what that means is I help other educators incorporate Indigenous content into their classroom and learning spaces. I'm also the chairwoman of the Montana Advisory Council on Indian Education. I also teach American Indian Studies, and thank you so much for having me today. We were on our drive down here from Great Falls earlier, and my husband's like, "What is this group?" And I was like, "I don't know." I said, "I just strongly believe that when Denise Juneau tells you to do something, you do it." So we Googled it, and now I know, and thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. I'm Steve Doherty, and I started out as an organizer with Northern Plains some 48 years ago in 1976. Since then, I have degenerated into a lawyer, and with my partner, Pat Smith, who was also a organizer for Northern Plains, as well as a member of the Fort Peck tribes, Pat and I practiced primarily Indian law for quite some time. And I was a Senate sponsor of House Bill 528 that Denise referred to. And then it was a singular honor for me to represent the Montana Indian Education Association, every single tribe in Montana, and a number of different Indian education organizations in the lawsuit to try and determine what quality education was. And Denise gave a very fair and accurate description of what happened. I can also say, as an ex-legislator, that she was way too nice to some of the people who opposed adequate funding for Indian education for all for many years. I refer to some of those people as lame, would be the kindest thing that I could say. And you'll hear more.
Hello, my name is Hal Schmid. I'm a European American and a third generation Montanan. And like I told people yesterday, I'm a Norwegian American. I was raised in Missoula, but I ended up, after working in the woods for 10 years, I ended up a teacher on the Flathead Reservation. And one of the things I needed to do to teach my Indian students was to learn more about them and their families and their culture so that I could be a good teacher and help them learn what they needed to learn to become who they're going to become. And so I was very fortunate at the time that Indian Education for All was being implemented. Like, how do we do this? I was administering federal grants in 4 schools on the reservation. And I was fortunate to have the time and work with Denise. I later even taught a course at the University of Montana. Denise was one of the first speakers that came and talked to in-service teachers in the summertime about how they could implement Indian Education for All. Thanks, Al.
Gachlin, my name is Perez. I am Totonac Indigenous from Mexico. I am first generation American, first generation college graduate, and also the Deputy Executive Director of Western Native Voice. And I want to just say it's truly an honor and pleasure to be here, not only with you all, but also with these illustrious folks here. And I will second if Denise says be somewhere. I just need to know what time and what to wear. So, and so my background, like I mentioned before, I am Indigenous to Mexico, and I mentioned that at the top of my introduction because it is the root of the solidarity that my father, my late father, taught me as both as a human being, but also more specifically as an Indigenous person to do everything that we can in our power as individuals to help our relatives that live in North, Central, South America, and even around the world, those who are Indigenous to different parts of the world. I began my journey in organizing with Western Native Voice back in 2017 after doing some, I wouldn't call it hobby, but on the side organizing in support of the water protectors out in Standing Rock, which was the first opportunity for me to really put action to the value system. And in the work that we do with Western Native Voice with community organizing as the model and building community action, it's all about helping folks act on their value systems. And so fortunate enough to be part of this wonderful group called Western Native Voice since 2017 and have been with the organization since and been involved with, and one of the reasons I was asked here, probably the main reason was experience sort of more contemporaneously with the legislature and some of the things that are going on. So I hope to provide some insight on that, and thank you very much.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for being here. And Hal is originally was the one who reached out to me and talked about having this kind of panel or Indian Education for All kind of panel at a Northern Plains conference. And it was sort of like, okay, I can see how, we can talk about organizing and cross-pollination of issues and all those types of things that need to happen in order to get real good policy done. So I could see that connection, but Hal, I just want you to speak a little bit about why Northern Plains is having this type of panel, like an education-focused panel at their conference.
So I can't say that because you made me. That's off the table, I guess. I'll say to start with, I first attended a presentation on Northern Plains Resource Council in Missoula around 1977 or 78, when I was back from college and working in the woods. And I think Jeannie Alderson's mom might have been there. I do remember Wally McRae read some cowboy poems. So it was a while ago, but I've followed this ever since. And the last couple of years, I've gotten more active. I'm on 2 task forces now, DEI and oil and gas. And I just want to say that I've learned so much from the oil and gas task force. They have longevity and understanding the issues dealing with the state and state agencies. And I've learned a lot about methane, bonding, capping orphaned and abandoned wells, and so on. In the same way, earlier, I had the opportunity to to learn from tribal elders in order to work with my students. Had to develop a relationship in order to do that. Yesterday, we listened to the different affiliates, and you can see them across the map here. The different affiliates from Northern Plains talk about what they were doing in their community in the last year and what they plan to do in the coming year. Each of these groups has a particular focus, and yet everyone in the room supported them and will support them. So it's an important network. And if you look at that group and where they are in the state, and you think about Indigenous Peoples Day, which right now is a county holiday and a city holiday in Missoula. It's celebrated in Bozeman, Gallatin County, I think Helena. But other than that, it's kind of marginal. I'm not sure what other communities. But this group yesterday accepted and voted to support a resolution to support replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day in Montana. And if you look at that map, if you look at the map here and see where our membership is, now look at the next map. Those are the reservations in Montana. If you combine the 2 maps, you've got a good chunk of this state. And there's a lot of cross-pollination and common issues that Northern Plains is dealing with, the same that our Indigenous communities are dealing with. It's a wonderful partnership that could be developed, and Indian Education for All is the start. You have to learn about your neighbors to be good neighbors and develop relationships. So that's why this panel. And I appreciate everyone coming here.
I would also say that there are wonderful provisions in the Montana Constitution. Northern Plains led the fight, led the fight towards creating a very important issue, which was don't mess with the Constitution. Now, there are histories. Everybody understands the recent health decision on clean and healthful environment and how important that is. Well, there are other decisions that try to bring life to the Constitution that are just as important. And the marrying up of the different provisions and the awareness of the different provisions, I think can make Northern Plains a very strong, a continued strong presence in defending and protecting the Constitution.
I'm going to go back to Steve as well. And, you know, we touched a little bit on the early legislative efforts, and you kind of forecasted a little bit about how hard and how there was some negativity as well. But I do want to point out, like during that session and that passage of the first legislative intent in House Bill 528, really, there was a Republican governor who signed it and was a great advocate for it. And there were Republican legislators as well who came alongside, had to, in order to get it passed. And so it is where those types of issues and mission and values align, and how the advocacy that continues today, sort of when you can find those nuggets, the kind of work that you can get done. But Steve, I want you to reflect a little bit on those early legislative efforts and attempts to get Indian Education for All into statute. How did the legislature view it, and what had to happen to get it done?
Thanks. First of all, in 2004, there was, as Denise mentioned, a lawsuit to try and force the legislature to adequately fund public schools in Montana. And in order to gain the force of law, there had to be a definition of quality public education. And I think Exhibit A in the plaintiff's lawsuit, and it was Columbia Falls was the name plaintiff, the Columbia Falls School District, but there were numerous other school districts and numerous other parties to the litigation. They had to determine the quality education. Exhibit A being the sordid failure by the state of Montana to do the right thing. And it took decades after the adoption of the 1972 Constitution. Those are great words. They're wonderful words. They don't mean a damn thing unless somebody breathes life into those words. Like the clean and healthful environment, those kids breathed life into the clean and healthful environment. Like Indian Education for All, it needed a lawsuit to force the legislature to do the right thing. I know this is an unusual point. The legislature doing the right thing, or being forced to do the right thing. But after 1972, there were a number of efforts made to somehow stand this highfalutin language up and give it meaning. There were efforts that were initially supported by labor, and then later opposed by the teachers union because they didn't want to have to take Indian education courses. And that law was eventually amended and dismissed entirely. But prior to 1990, Indian Education for All passed in 1999, and the chief House sponsor was Carol Juneau. The chief Senate sponsor was none other than the lady who brought the amendment in the Constitutional Convention, Dorothy Eck, who was this lovely person. And in terms of mentoring and respecting your elders, I learned so much as Dorothy Eck's seatmate, because she was the one in the Senate who could shut the racists up. Because when they tried to explain why they weren't going to do something, Dorothy was the person who could raise her hand and say, well, you know, as a matter of the Constitutional Convention, I was there. And not only was I there, I sponsored the language that we're talking about. And when you try and tell me how to interpret it, why, that's just not going to fly. And it didn't fly because of the perseverance and the strength of primarily two women, one of them being Carol Juneau in the House, and she's a ball of fire. And the other person was in the Senate, and Tom Tao can attest to this as well, was Dorothy Eck. And she may have been tiny and spoke in a very quiet and dignified way, but she was a ball of fire. And it was those, in my view, two strong women who made it possible to pass the legislation. Now, the legislation passed Indian Education for All in 1999. It wasn't implemented until 2004, and only as a result of a trial court in Helena, similar to Held, handing down a decision that the state was failing in education, and a affirmation by a unanimous Montana Supreme Court, which is why we need to be very careful about the Supreme Court. But that's just a short lesson in political intrigue and hypocrisy, which I know is unusual for this group of people.
Yeah, thanks. And Steve, thank you for all your legislative and public service to Montana, and just know that, you know, we look back and know that you were part of all of those efforts, and just thank you for getting us here and doing some good things. And then I guess, you know, Steve kind of referenced my mom as a ball of fire. You should try growing up with her. No, she was awesome. But speaking of women who are balls of fire, I do want to pass it over to Jordann and just talk a little bit about you're engaged with educators across the state. You do a lot of work through your consulting firm. Countrywide, you're at national conferences and such. Tell us sort of how you view from your seat working with educators. What does the landscape look like here in Montana? And how do other states, when you're visiting with them, or unlikely allies, how do they view all of that?
Yeah, so throughout my work, I can't stress how proud I am about the state of Montana. We're the only state that IEFA is constitutionally protected in. Other states, so Wyoming was the 12th state just last summer to get legislation that mandates educators must be incorporating IEFA into their classroom. And then before that, it was North Dakota. The governor has since rescinded that. And so I would say there's now 11 and a half, I don't know where North Dakota's at with this, 11 and a half states that have this some form of legislation. But again, Montana is the only one with it constitutionally protected. And, you know, sometimes I don't always get to say that Montana's ahead in things, but Montana really is. And so with my work with other educators in other states, similar to what happened in Montana, this came through, you know, the late 1990s, this statewide mandate, but it wasn't until 2004-5 era that they pledged educational funding towards this. You know, it's really hard to go to educators and say, you need to do this. They didn't go to school for that, you know. They need some help and some support. And what I'm seeing it happen throughout the United States is that the mandates and the legislation is coming through, which is great. You know, it's so important, it's vital, but teachers are lacking resources and direction. It's really easy to tell teachers what to do, but it's the resources and the guidance is what these states are lacking. And so that's part of my work through consultation, is showing them and demonstrating, modeling how to begin IEFA in their classroom and through their state.
I would just say, like, I'm still doing a little bit of work on that end as well, and just finished some work with New Jersey, who's actually starting their own Indian Education for All journey, which is very different. I mean, every state's going to look different, but like Jordann said, it's spreading, and people look to Montana as the leader. And so they're always like saying, how did you do that? How did that get done? And what's happening now? And so I think it's pretty awesome that all these states kind of are following, and they're following a similar path, like essential understandings and teacher training. And so, yeah, it's been quite a journey that's been, you know, it's been good to watch and good to be a part of, especially as other states are engaging. And so, Taheen, how is Western Native Voice, like you talked about your organizing skills, and how has Western Native Voice been engaged in organizing communities, and how did IEFA play into that organizing?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for the question. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Western Native Voice, we are an organization that uses a community organizing model that is aimed to inspire Native leadership so our communities flourish. And we do that through 4 distinct programs: civic education, civic engagement, public policy advocacy, and leadership development. All of those sort of intermix, as you are probably familiar with in this work of building change. And so one of the first initiatives that I was involved with when I joined the organization back in 2017 during that legislative session was on an issue that the organization had identified previously, particularly from urban areas, urban schools, regarding the wearing of tribal regalia and objects of cultural significance at events such as graduations, where there were many stories of heartache and just threats of not being able to participate in the ceremony of graduation if there were any modifications, regardless of how culturally sensitive or appropriate they were for that life event, right? These graduations are major life events for individuals, and in a world where culturally a lot of those rites of passages have been stripped from Indigenous peoples, these are incredibly important rites of passages, and so we could the organization could feel the visceral impact and the negative impact on families, on students, and communities. And so the organization, we sought to work with the legislators, with the legislative process, knowing that this was a way to build momentum, and part of that organizing strategy was to show that people from distinct communities from across the state are coming together at the Capitol. And so we worked with Senator Jen Gross from Billings as a main sponsor back in 2017 for what would be called Senate Bill 319, or the Regalia Bill. And the legislative process of that bill was very difficult. It was essentially dead on arrival before we really got anywhere. It died in committee, and it needed to be resuscitated through a sort of Hail Mary, for those of you familiar with football terminology, a Hail Mary play to try to get through what's called a blast motion, to take it from the committee where it was stonewalled and have it given the opportunity to have its fair shake on the Senate floor. And because of work with both Democrats and Republicans, it was successful on the Senate floor, and from there we didn't look back. And part of what we were hearing a lot in committee, particularly in the Senate, and then later on in floor debates, was that certain legislators, and I'll allow you to fill in the blanks, felt that, or believed that this would cause a, quote, disruption or distraction from the proceedings of graduation, which is not only insulting, but also is a clear demonstration of white supremacy culture and how it is just pervasive in worldviews and pervasive in what is considered proper. And so all of these things of like, we can't disturb the sanctity of this graduation with any distractions. And so it's anyway, so as a result, of course there's outrage for that. And as we were trying to get this over the line, we thought back, how can we really respond to this in a way that is not only expresses the reality, but also builds community and also brings in leaders through that building that native leadership. And so we did a call out on social media asking folks to send in pictures of themselves wearing their tribal regalia, and ideally if they graduated from college or whatever. And we were flooded with just inundated with pictures, and we memeified them. For those of you who know what memes are, back there were really early on memes. It was just words, and on the top it said "my culture," and at the bottom it said "is not a distraction." And it was to demonstrate what it looks like to be, to demonstrate your culture and be proud of it, and to live in it, right? And to, by living it, preserving it and forwarding it to future generations. And so with that, as well as a very sort of last minute clever organization ahead of a very important House committee hearing, where we are actually able to bring in some youth from different parts of the state. And they wore beaded mortarboards as they were waiting in line to provide testimony in favor of House Bill 319. And so those images are even if you Google Montana Regalia Bill, those images will still, that image of 3 teenage students wearing beaded mortarboards, waiting to have their voices heard, remains one of the strongest images from that. And I think that in and of itself was the reason why Senate Bill 319 was able to pass the House committee and then eventually become the first law of its kind in any state in the country. And since then, that similar policy has been transferred to other states where, from North Dakota to Alaska to the East Coast, municipalities and school districts have borrowed that initial work that we were able to do here together collectively as community to make this kind of change that was so impactful to so many students across the state. So really, it was an honor. It was a privilege of a lifetime to be able to even be tangentially part of that, right? And that's another note of how important youth organizing is, that getting the youth involved, particularly in to make those connections to how the world and policy impacts them through litigation and other methods. And so that's just one way and how we're keeping, and from then on, we're keeping our eyes out on every legislative session, trying to keep all the legislators honest in the very various ways that we can, including bringing people with brown skin who look Native into those buildings so that those, especially the non-Native legislators, will never forget that they are the constituents as well.
Thank you. I think there's always this idea of like how much representation matters, right? It's sort of like I think back to when there were just less than a handful of Native legislators during the session, and now there's, I think, like 11 Native legislators, and the kind of work that they can do because of the caucus that they come together. They're bipartisan. They're able to work with different types of groups. And so, I think in this movement, it definitely matters who sits in those seats of power, definitely. And they also have to work with unlikely allies. And so just very quickly, before we get to Q&A, why don't each of you just tell me, like, in your work, who is an unlikely ally that you have had to partner with in order to get something done?
I would say most recently, the Great Falls Police Department. What was happening in Great Falls was there was an undeniable over-ticketing of Indigenous people for no driver's license, no insurance, no registration. And I was so honored and pleased that they wanted to do something about that. The captain wanted to do something about it, and it took the education piece concerning disenfranchisement, socioeconomics, the histories of certain federal policies, that keep individuals kind of stuck at times. And so through that work, we were able to come up with maybe ticketing or fining, things like community service, allowing people to have the same opportunities and the same chances as everybody else has been very special to watch in Great Falls.
I would have to say partnering up with the numerous school districts across the state in the initial litigation to try and determine what a quality education was and what that meant in terms of money. And as Denise pointed out, we not only had Governor Roscoe in support of funding Indian education for all. The big question was, you passed it, now are you going to fund it? But Governor Marks suggested as well full funding. It disappeared in some legislative magic, but it provided enormous grist for the mill to be able to say to the court, look, all they do is pass something. You got to put your money where your mouth is if you want to do Indian education for all.
Testing. Okay, great. Great question. In the legislative arena, this is always going to be a place where you're going to have really unlikely allies. Speaking specifically on Indian education for all, the most recent legislative session that happened this year, there was a law, House Bill 338, that passed. And part of that is providing, what it does is it provides requires reporting on how money is spent by school districts receiving these IEFA funds. And if they are not in compliance, they get that money taken away from them. And if they don't, if they fail to report how they use the money, then they don't get funding at all until they're able to do that. And so in that process, so many non-native voices came in to explain why this was important. The Department of Education, OPI, came in support of it. There were just seeing the diversity of people in the room, because as you know, as Indigenous people and as people of color broadly, you know, oftentimes our stories and our experiences are sort of up for debate, right? They're up for, well, maybe that's not the case, or and so to see that, knowing that non-people of color, non-Indigenous people show up and provide opponent testimony on something like House Bill 338 to make sure that there is that accountability is always, for me, a huge reminder that there are others out there that actually are paying attention and caring, including those of you in this room, and hopefully that spreads out. Speaking more broadly about other things, so we were one legislative session, we were part of a coalition which included Americans for Prosperity, of all people, on something it was to do with court fees. And so because it was something that they cared about, we cared about, ACLU cared about, this was, we found ourselves in a very strange collection of groups. And so so whenever these kinds of things that sort of there's an intersection of different parts of our society, different groups and sub-demographics of our society get together for these very broad topics, you're often seeing yourselves with, but you never thought you would. And in our work with the Secretary of State's office on keeping them honest about voting rights, that's another place where we often see ourselves in the same room with folks that, to put it lightly, don't believe in voting rights for everyone. So
let's toss it over to you all, and come on up if you have a question. Should have known Tom wouldn't be shy.
Does that work? Okay. Well, I think we can learn a lot of things from history, and I appreciate that. I want to remind you of something that Steve mentioned briefly, and that is that there was something that was passed by the legislature fully supportive of this matter long time before. In fact, if my memory is correct, I think it was in 1975 that Polly Holmes, Representative Polly Holmes from Billings, came up to me and said, you know, there's a really good provision in the Constitution about Indian education, and we ought to do something about it. And I worked with her, and we drafted a bill. It was introduced. There wasn't a lot of opposition. It went through, and it did say that if you want to teach in a county with an Indian reservation or in an adjoining county, you must show that you have taken some courses in about Indian history and culture. That passed. That was the law. The governor signed it, and it was the law in this state for some time. But when Polly Holmes and I were out of the legislature, guess what? The teachers in particular came up and said, no, that's too burdensome. We don't want to have to do that. So you got to repeal that law. And they did. Now, the history, the lesson I think that we can get from that, there may be several. One, you got to have some finances with it. We didn't. You've got to have more support. We didn't. More support in the sense of other things going on. But perhaps most of all, don't forget, even now, it's not clear that that can't be repealed, that what you have done can't be repealed, and we might have the same situation we had before. That is a lesson we better not forget.
So not a question, but great narrative.
Hi, I are a retired teacher. I taught student taught in Hardin many years ago, and upon retiring, I did some supervisory work of student teachers as they were going into the field. And during my supervision time, I had to observe three of their lessons. One had to do with Indian education, and so it's really interesting observing them, particularly PE. Having them develop effective lesson plans in PE. So my question is it didn't seem like they really were very prepared. It didn't make any difference which content it was. And oftentimes I'd be in the classroom, and even the classroom teacher, I saw a variety of lessons. Some were just great lessons, you know, really like 2 or 3 weeks involved in like a unit or whatever, went into depth, and the spirit was really there in terms of what they were trying to do. But some of them were not that way at all. So I guess my question is first of all, I know that you do a lot of that sort of training with teachers. Is there plans for more of that to be happening? Because I feel as though they really need it. And since we have this act in process, we need to make sure that effective, good instruction is being happened in the classroom rather than just check out the box. Well, I got that unit done or whatever. So it's so important to really deliver a really effective lesson. And I'm just kind of wondering how you feel as though we can do that.
Very quickly. I call this AD. The Bible calls this AD, after death. I call it after Denise was the superintendent. So that's a great question. Thank you so much. When Denise was superintendent, we had a very robust statewide initiatives in terms of teacher development and teacher training and teacher opportunities. Something happened though, and it's kind of gone downhill just a little bit, but the effort is still there. The folks at the Office of Public Instruction in Indian Education Department, I mean, they're still rocking and rolling. Something that they have recently done is created a hub course online where you educators from anywhere, other educators in different states, watch these webinar series of demonstration of implementation. There's a best practices conference that was rocking and rolling, very robust, roughly 8 years ago. And it's weaned a little bit, but there's still the effort, there's still the intent. I think that where the hesitation is that educators don't want to do something wrong, and they don't want to do something wrong, so they just freeze, right? Educators sometimes, unfortunately, have large egos, and they don't always know to say, I need help. Can you help me with this?
I would just add on, you know, when all this started and the funding came, we did like build, we have over 300 lesson plans in every curricular area, you know, best practices. And I would just say one thing about the statewide best practices conference. That's when I knew Indian Education for All was robust, because for the first time ever, we had a non-Indian keynoting an Indian Education conference, telling other non-Indians, this is why it's important. And so that was pretty powerful. And I will just say, elections matter.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. I guess I have more of a comment than a question. I am a public school teacher. I teach out in Pryor, and I can speak a little bit to the issue of why teachers do or don't implement Indian Education for All. But I think one of the biggest ones I know for my colleagues is remind me of your name again? Jordann. Like Jordann said, I think for a lot of white educators, it's not wanting to say the wrong thing. And so they don't say anything, or they don't feel comfortable with it. The other thing is time. Oh my God, being a public school teacher is quite overwhelming. There's so much on our plates, and there's so much we want to do, but we don't have the time and we don't have the resources a lot of the time. And so as we were sitting here and these guys were talking, and somebody, a couple of times the word cross-pollination came up, and my wheels started spinning, and I'm thinking that Northern Plains could have a really interesting opportunity to work with Indian Education for All to maybe create some curriculum around the issues that, like was mentioned, like are important to both tribes and our organization. One thing that jumped immediately to my mind was the whole history of the totem pole that we have in front of our building. Like, that's a fascinating story that ties in our land issues with Indian education, and like coming up with a series of lessons that teachers could implement that are just ready for them to teach with some of that history. Could be a great way to get young people interested in our issues, interested in Native issues, and kind of this organization lacks young people a little bit. So I'm really glad that we had this panel. I was kind of surprised too. I was like, why are they having an education panel at a Northern Plains conference? But as an educator, like now that that cross-pollination was mentioned, like I think that this could be a really great thing for getting young people involved and helping educators in our community, like giving them some resources, because we want to do this. And I do this because I have a lot of experience with it, but a lot of my colleagues don't. And it's because they don't have the time, they don't have the knowledge. But if somebody handed them a really awesome curriculum and said, here you go, it's tied to the standards and it's got all this cool stuff your kids will love, they'll be like, great, I'm going to do it. So just thought I'd put that out there.
I would just add, thank you for that, because when all this started, and Jordann kind of alluded to it, of when we first started this, I mean, our whole thing, and it was really hard, but like Tom said, there had been a law about Indian, or teachers need to take this course, and there was a lot of hitbacks, and so it went away, and that still probably needs to happen. But we sort of start moving on beyond blame, shame, and guilt. That was sort of our mantra, is like teachers don't know. They grew up in a system where they learned nothing, and now we're saying teach about Indians. And so we really took that approach of, okay, then let's sort of back up, and we need to fill them with knowledge so that they can then sort of implement it. One thing I will say, and I really like that idea, because that is sort of the unlikely allies that we need to have in order to get all of this stuff done. One of the first groups that we worked with at the state level was state parks. And they had an Indigenous history at every state park. And so we started working with them about developing lessons that could be place-based when kids went out there. Well, I think we have time for one more question.
Well, I'm Representative Connie Keogh. I'm a member of Northern Plains for a long time. And as I was getting closer to the mic, my questions were getting answered. But first of all, I just want to thank you all for your service and your work through the years on this important topic. My first question was going to be about House Bill 338, but then you were sharing about it. And I am very proud to have been involved with that, and grateful, because it really is going to make a difference. And probably more than anything, just the language. It was used, it previously said provide Indian education for all. And I mean, it said encourage, now it says provide. And that's huge, really, really huge. So I guess if I do have, first of all, I have to say this. I always do what Denise says. And with redistricting, I have a new district thing. No, it's all good. We're going to have a stronger, we're going to have more Democrats in the legislature this next session, and that is a good thing. Okay. So if I have one question is, how will I know, how will we in the legislature know that this latest piece of legislation is moving forward in the way it should? And what should I be watching for as a member of the Education Budget Subcommittee, as these constitutional players are working around the new language of the bill and the requirements? So what should we be watching for? And I hope the answer is something more about who to elect for the Office of Public Instruction next fall. So is that a fair question? Go for it. Thank you.
I'll take a stab at that. First first part of the question. And so I think some of the things that our organization is doing right now is a lot of outreach to communities. We actually finished a small community tour where we went to basically every hamlet, every little town on every reservation, and just talked about the legislative session. And 338 came up, and one of the things that we encourage parents and families and adults is to keep your school district accountable by requesting those reports, because there is right to know laws of information from public schools that's been upheld through court cases. And so that is what we're encouraging the public to do, especially out for the folks that we work with in both in rural and urban communities, is request those, demand those. They are public knowledge, and that is how we keep them accountable.
Great. Thank you, Connie, for that question. So we are, I know we could talk about this all day. I could. So thank you, panelists, but I do want to sort of end with a question to all of you about what is one lesson you have learned along the way that would help our allies like Northern Plains come alongside different and unlikely groups to work for justice? What's one lesson?
You got to be nicer than you want to be most of the time. No, it's about all of us. And I don't think that it's about one group more than it is about any group. And that's not what Indian education is about either. It's about leveling the playing field. And once we understand, everyone understands that Montana is Montana, and that means everybody. That means everybody, every single one of us needs to be brought to the table to give our input. And I'm really proud of where we're at right now, but I know that we still have a lot of work to do.
I think my advice would be open and be educable, and to look for the angles. And I really like the story about Western Native Voice and teaming up with AFP. That's amazing. That couldn't happen if you instantly recoiled and didn't want to have anything to do with them because of the positions they've taken. But being open to being educated is the key. And one part of that education, if you ever feel inclined to read the debates in the Constitutional Convention, which I did in preparation for this panel, it's amazing to me how open and engaging, thoughtful, and generous the founders were. I fear that empathetic approach may be gone. So we have to be open to being educated to keep it there.
I worked across many schools on the Flathead Reservation, not only with education and grants, but starting a Boys and Girls Club on the reservation. And so I was privileged to see a lot of teachers teach. And I had some teachers occasionally tell me, I'm colorblind. I treat all kids the same. And I knew there was something wrong with that, but it took me quite a while to figure out how to respond. So I wouldn't say anything. After all, I'm a white male, college educated. I'm the privileged status, but I knew something was wrong. And I finally figured it out. And when people would say, I treat all kids the same, I would say, oh, that's great. You treat them all like boys or all like girls? And they would say, oh, that's different. Well, it wasn't before Title IX. And so I think that's what I learned was that the best teachers I observed and in the classrooms I was in, they treated every kid special. They allowed that kid to bring out what was in them, and they helped that student. Every kid is special. And I think when we work with other groups, is what's special about them? What gifts do they have? The best teachers teach that way.
Can I just say very quickly? Oh, sorry. Yep. Clap, clap, clap. When anyone says to me that they're colorblind, I ask them, what do they do at traffic lights?
You gotta wonder.
Hold on, I'll just
yeah,
add on to that. So I was with Eric Fever one time and we were walking downtown Billings here and we were stopped at a stoplight, and you know how the walk sign comes on and then the stop sign is red. And so I looked over and the guy showed up to walk, and I was like, well, you know, when the white man shows up, you got to go.
That's really solid advice. No, I think a couple things come up for me. One is the word empathy. I think, you know, put it really well, opening your heart to empathy. And then the other thing is a phrase that I heard once is that there's you never have permanent friends and you never have permanent enemies. And so keeping that approach, both of those, holding space for those both at the same time, as well as the third thing is, you know, they're understanding your boundaries as well. There are some things that just, you know, just values like being anti-genocide is just a non-negotiable, right? Those are boundaries that we hold. And so being able to hold all of those things is very complicated, but know that we're all on the path to it, right? And so if we can hold grace and hold space for each other to make those mistakes and make those lessons, those opportunities to learn, I think that we can all move forward in a better way. So
Yeah, I would just add briefly about, you know, kind of harkening back to my beginning statements about we have a long way to go in this country. Like, we are more divided than ever on all kinds of issues. And so it is sometimes strange to find yourself in rooms with people who you would vehemently disagree with. And I'll just tell one story. Is sort of like, I belong to this group called the Aspen Rodel. And what they were doing is they were finding sort of lower level political elected people from all across the country to come together and sit at tables. And it was bipartisan, Republicans, Democrats. And so I got to go to one class, and it was a year-long class. And we met 4 times a year, different places. And it really was, they were trying to say, these people we think will end up in Congress. And so if they can come together and not talk politics, not talk issues, we went back to the basics of reading about our democracy, what it meant, bringing in all these lessons and having just conversations about what is democracy? What does democracy mean? How does it play out? How did it get formed here? In the hopes that when people got to Congress, then they would know each other and be able to reach across the aisle. And I think for my class, I've seen several of them now reach that level. And they are the people who are trying to come together to try to figure out pathway through. Of course, they get caught up in all the politics and all that kind of stuff. But knowing them on a personal level really does make a difference. And if we can make an effort, even with those who we, like, I can hold a grudge, just so you know. But even those that we can come together who we vehemently disagree and try to find some sort of commonality, we will, like, just much like Michelle Obama, like, we have to go high and we have to be the bigger person to try to reach across the aisle and try to do things. And as hard as it is, I always appreciate the people who are able to do that. A lot of times I'm not able to, but just thinking about, you know, how this gets done and thinking about what you all heard here, my final comments are just like, when you want to get something done, send lawyers, guns, and money. Thank you all for being here.